Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Doranforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each fortnight, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations with leaders, activists, and thinkers from the world of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas. G'day, Curtinistas. Welcome back to episode 2 of Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas, hosted by myself, Nick Doranforth, Executive Director of the JCRC, and my good mate, Cosmas Samaras, or Cozzy, as we like to call him. Cozzy, co-director of Redbridge Group, Victorian Labor veteran survivor. Cozzy, how are you, mate? How was your weekend?
Yeah, pretty good. Busy, work and a bit of running, cycling, weights, the usual thing.
You're the Forrest Gump of Melbourne's northwest.
That's it.
We're about to talk to a super impressive, super special guest.
Yep.
The Treasurer of Australia, Jim Chalmers. But before we speak to Jim, because Jim is obviously consumed by this election year, I want to talk to you about the polls and this weekly track polling that you've been doing with the News Court tabloids out again yesterday. And what it showed was Labor, off the back of, we've seen a single interest rate cut, this huge $10 million promised spending on Medicare.
Whaler.
Whaler, $2 billion.
Yep, very important.
To save the Whaler steelworks and jobs, this industry that is so important. People don't realise how important steel is.
You'll be surprised how many people across the country raised Whaler with us.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily from South Australia.
So on the back of that, we're seeing Labor clawing back some ground in these critical marginal seats that you're tracking. But there are still a number of seats, I think 8 seats here in Victoria, or is that nationally?
Yeah.
Which are under threat from Peter Dutton's coalition.
Yeah, so look, what the second wave of the track illustrates is some tightening in favour of Labor in particularly every other state except for Victoria. Obviously, Labor's travelling really well in Western Australia. Things are looking a little bit better in New South Wales, and that's critical because that's a swing state. And not much change in Queensland and all the other states. That doesn't mean Labor's not losing territory to the coalition in those seats. It's just that, we expect, for example, basically in Western Australia, Bullwinkle to go to the coalition, for example, because on paper it's already on their side. However, the big problem that Labor faces is obviously in the state of Victoria. The two-party preferred vote for the coalition's north of 55. I like to use a general descriptor here because sample numbers are still quite small, although we now have enough data points to suggest there's a pattern emerging, and it's not a really good one for the Labor side of politics in Victoria. So we are seeing a pattern, and that pattern suggests that we could see up to half a dozen seats in play, and not necessarily lost. This is something we need to emphasise. A good day for Labor at the moment in Victoria is they lose 2 seats. A bad day is they lose half a dozen.
Yeah, but the critical thing about seats being in play, as you know, because you've been there, sandbagging, you have to devote money
a lot of
and
resources. Absolutely.
Money and resources.
That front's pretty big
money
in Victoria.
Talks, baby.
Yeah, that front's pretty big in Victoria. And so that does then take away from Labor's capacity to look at opportunities elsewhere. I know there's some potentially an opportunity in Queensland with regards to the federal seat of Brisbane, for example. So there is that challenge that the Labor campaign has to obviously confront. So that's a quick snapshot.
On the flip side, Dutton, I was quite taken by, there are challenges for Dutton. I was quite taken by another one of the findings from this poll, which showed an improvement in Australians' optimism about the future. So the percentage of Aussies
Yes.
who think their country, generally speaking, is heading in the right direction, has jumped up from 27 to 33%.
Still bad,
And the
but
pessimist,
it's better.
it's not great, mate. But you got a small. You got to take all the wins, mate.
That's
You got
right.
to take all the wins. I used to support the Fitzroy Football Club in
then,
AFL, mate.
Then you are very much comfortable in that space.
There was one win in our last season. You've got to take all the wins. And the pessimists fell from 55 to 50. That's still a lot that's 1 in 2 pessimists. But there's some hope there for Labor. And I guess that on that word hope, can we read into this? And we're going to talk to the Treasurer about this in a moment's time. Is Dutton being too negative? Does he have a problem with selling hope to the electorate? Because people are, being buffeted by.
I'm actually quite shocked of how flat-footed they've been.
Yeah,
I expected the coalition to come out with a vision, because all the data points to now suggest that that's exactly what Australians are starving for. They all know the world that they're moving into is going to be drastically different to the one they grew up in. And they're looking for leadership that's going to basically say to them, look, we don't have a silver bullet here to fix the problem, but we do have...
Trying. We're on your side.
We have a suite of policies that will potentially help you and help this country move through that transition. Now, the team that pulls that off successfully or even gets close to it is going to carry the night come election. I mean, this is... And the types of voters that we're talking about that are starving for this vision, this hope, are in the suburbs and the regions, because they are the people who are going to potentially suffer the most or not suffer the most, depending on whether a government of the day in this country succeeds in buffering them from those changes. They are the ones who are at the epicenter of these changes, and they know it. They know it. So they're looking for that. And if they don't get it from a particular party, and they get it too late, and this is where I say that the coalition's probably entering a space now where they are strategically at a disadvantage. They let their run too late, it could be significant problems for them, even in Victoria.
Okay, Cos, enough of talking about polls. We've got someone who's in the heart of the poll dance, in the poll action at the moment. A good friend of ours, a good friend of the John Curtin Research Centre, Treasurer Jim Chalmers. And it's one of the great things about Jim becoming Treasurer is I don't need to do these elongated 5-minute introductions, which I used to do, trawling through Jim's career trajectory. I can now simply say that Jim Chalmers has been Treasurer of Australia in the Albanese Labor government since May 2022. He, of course, is a member of the Australian Labor Party and has served as Labor member for Rankin since 2013. Treasurer, Jim, Comrade Chalmers, how are you? And happy birthday for yesterday.
Oh, thanks very much, guys. Thanks for having me on your podcast as well. I'm looking forward to a good yak about all things politics at a pretty important time politically, but also economically.
Yes, mate. It's a big year for you, big year, election year. How are you, before we dive into politics, how are you holding up? What are you getting up to outside the grind of, I was going to say 9 to 5.
It's not 9 to 5.
It's 12. It's 12 to 12. The 24/7 grind of being treasurer of this great country. What are you getting up to kind of keep yourself sane?
Oh, 2 things. I'm trying to get back into the running. I'm a bit reluctant to say that with Cos on the call, given he punches out a couple of 100 Ks before breakfast. He runs more in a day than I run in a year at the moment. So I'm reluctant to say I'm an average runner, but I'm an enthusiastic one, and I'm trying to get back into it. So that's part of it. But also, you guys would know, I've got little kids. They like playing sport, and so probably my favourite thing is to go along to the Logan Thunder at Cornubia there near our place and watch my kids play basketball.
It does get harder. I've jumped back into. I've been hitting the gym, but it's harder with 3 kids, and I won't reveal how old Jim and I were. I'm born 2 weeks to the day after Jim, but,
right?
For us. Aging millennials, Jim,
you still have children problems.
It becomes harder to put in the Ks, but not all superhuman like Cos. One of our heroes, Paul Keating, it's certainly one of he's, along with Bob Hawke, he's the reason that I got interested in politics. A part of it is just, it's in the blood. I often say that the Labor Party chose me. I didn't choose the Labor Party. My family history is on both sides, just full of left-wing and Labor activists. But, Bob Hawke grabbed me, this ochre intellectual, as PM, and the other person who grabbed me as an unusual child, a pre-teenager who loved watching Parliament on TV with my dad, loved watching Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister, and all those types of shows. Keating grabbed me, and I know he grabbed you. One of Keating's way of sort of de-stressing and dealing with the cut and grind of politics was he used to turn up to Parliament quite late. He used to sit in the bath, I think, and listen to Marla and think about the world. Are you having sort of long baths? And I don't think, from what I understand, you're not into Marla. You're more of a hip hop guy. I'm not sure if you're into Snoop Doggy Dogg, but
I'm an early start. I am a hip hop guy, but I'm an early starter as well. The best start to the day for me is to get out for a gallop. I like to do that ideally before the sun comes up. I think strangely, the earlier I start, the better the day usually goes for me. If I can get a gallop in, if I can get my head right for the day, then usually that's the best way to prep. And I'm a big admirer of Paul's. I wouldn't be here without Paul Keating, but we've probably got different work habits when it comes to the way that he used to prepare himself.
I don't think you can get away with that anymore.
No.
Nice idea.
I'm an early starter.
But on touching on Keating, and we before we went live, we were talking about generational differences. I tried to claim that we're all Gen X. You are adamant that we're Gen Y. I'm going with the millennial stuff.
There's only one Gen Xer in this conversation. It's me.
Yeah. The Treasurer said we're millennials. We're millennials. But on the generation question, you are a genuine Labor thinker. You thought about what it means to be Labor, what it means to be Labor, what it means to be a reformist Labor government in the 21st century. As a staffer, chief of staff, you had a front row seat during the global financial crisis. You've written different books. You wrote a really interesting. I'm one of the few people, Jim, that's read your PhD thesis on Keating as brawler statesman. But you wrote a really interesting article for the Griffith Review. I think it's 10 years ago now. Where does time go? On this concept of nostalgia, this idea that, particularly for the Labor side of politics, for all sides of politics really, but we're caught in this nostalgic grip that, coming back to Hawke and Keating, these guys did great stuff. They've transformed Australia. They did it in the best Labor tradition, with the hard heads, soft hearts. But we've got to this juncture where people seem to think that the only way of being a Labor government is, rinse and repeating Hawke and Keating 2.0. And actually, no. It's, a new generation's come along, Gen X, Gen Y, late boomers. It's time to give us a go. And I think this is, I don't mean to verbal your argument there in nostalgia and the Griffith Review, but I mean, you think there's a generational thing at play, and we've got different dragons to slay.
Yeah, I think there are a few important points in that, Nick. I mean, first of all, you mentioned this idea of kind of generations. I genuinely believe that we've got intergenerational responsibilities, to each other in Labor terms, but also in terms of our country and where it fits in the world. And there's no bigger admirer of Paul Keating in the Parliament, arguably in Australia, than me. I wouldn't be here without him, as I said. I remember as a sort of a late teenager picking up the biography written by the late, great Michael Gordon about Paul Keating and just couldn't believe that there was this political figure who combined the kind of the big changes and the earthy language and just telling a story about our country and telling a story about where people fit in all of that change that he was so central to. And so whether it's that nostalgia piece that you refer to or whether it's my outlook more broadly, I embrace the Hawke Keating legacy, absolutely embrace it at every opportunity. And our job is not to kind of double back and retrace their steps, as important as they were. Our job is to walk further in the same direction, to build on that legacy rather than kind of try and replicate it or photocopy it. And so when I say that, I'm not in any way disrespectful to the legacy. It's immense legacy.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be here without it, but our job is to add to it, not try and replicate it. And so if you think about the big changes that Paul led as Treasurer and then as Prime Minister, the equivalent for us now is really the energy transformation, how we embrace and adapt and adopt technology, how we get the human capital side of it right. That's really our equivalent now. And those are our responsibilities now. And we can do that building on what's become before us rather than replicating it or rejecting it. I do neither of those two things.
It's the best way of honouring that legacy, isn't it? Is actually to update it the 21st century. I mean, Keeney and Co didn't rock around in the 80s saying, we're going to bring back the world of John Curtin and even, Gough Whitlam. They knew that, they had dragons to slay in the 80s and they got down to work. It's a bit like, I use the analogy, nowadays we've got sat nav, on the way here, I got here using Google Maps. But imagine telling people, no, actually, we're junking that and we're going to bring back the UBDs and the Melways. I'm not sure what you've got up in there in Brisbane, Jim, but we've got
it's called a Refidex. It's called a Refidex in Brisbane.
I didn't know
UBD
that.
works too.
I didn't know that.
I think what they did successfully was they saw what was coming on the horizon and they positioned their constituency.
Totally.
They talked up to people.
That's right.
Totally.
Right? So this is, I think, what, your generation is now tasked with, and that is the world's going through significant changes again, massive changes. And the job of politicians like yourself and others is to position the people that we represent, the Labor Party, to actually take advantage of those changes and, to be frank, also buffer them for some of the negative traits about it too.
Totally. I mean, this is my obsession. This is kind of my reason for being, right, is to recognise that our responsibilities as political leaders is to understand all of the churn and change and uncertainty in the world and to work out how we position our people to be beneficiaries of that change rather than victims of that change. And at different periods over, really since Federation, there have been these kind of inflection points in our economy. I like using the framework that Paul Keating came up with, which is to basically say, if you think about the big economies and the big inflections in our economy, they happen about every 40 years in Australia. So at Federation, we had an economy which was largely colonial and agricultural. By the time of Chifley, it was still agricultural, but became a bit more industrial and protected. Paul built the third Australian economy, opened it up to the world, big reliance on financial services, a big modernisation project. And so we're due for another one. And Nick gave me a great opportunity at the John Curtin Research Centre to talk about what the fourth economy looks like for Australia. We are due for a new economy, and it will be powered by cleaner and cheaper energy. It will make the most of the technological revolution. It will recognise our responsibilities in the care economy. It'll have a big emphasis on human capital and on competition policy. And so the way you just talked about that, Cos, couldn't be closer to the way I think about our generational task, which is to build this new economy in a way that ordinary people in suburbs like the one I grew up in and the ones I represent now, which are the same ones I grew up in, to make sure that people are part of the story of churn and change in a positive way, that they are beneficiaries, not victims of all of that change. And we've seen at different times in our history how when the economy changes, people are at risk of being left behind. And so much of what we do is about trying to meet that generational task that we've been called to.
I think that's an opportunity for a struggling Labor Party in Australia at the moment to start telling that story in a much more profound way going forward, because the populist right don't have that interest. That's not their mission.
Yeah.
Their mission is not to position the working person, the people that we care about, to take advantage of those changes, buffer them from those changes. Their mission is to just exploit the grievance that currently exists and not deal with those, incredibly entrenched structural problems.
They talk about, we'll ask Jim to reflect on this.
Yeah.
They talk about draining the swamp. They talk about taking it up to elites on behalf of working class people, working class battlers, but they've got no interest in actually, draining the swamps of real power and privilege, which still happen to be economic.
Yeah.
And Jim, it's also quite personal for you, isn't it? Like you said that this is personal. This is generational and it's personal. And this ties in with, your attraction to Keating, because you're products of the suburbs. Keating from Bankstown and you're the boy from Logan City. So tell us, what does it mean for you to be a boy from Logan City, born there, raised there, and now lucky enough to represent the people of Logan City? What does it actually mean for you, deep in your bones, being a boy from Logan City, and why this is such a deeply personal mission for you in political life?
Well, where I'm from means everything to me, and I still draw great inspiration from the neighbourhoods and the suburbs that I grew up in, and I feel a real responsibility to my area. I want people to understand I'm working around the clock for the country, but also for them. We launched our local campaign on Saturday in Logan Central. And we talk there about Labor people. We believe we get more done when we work together rather than on our own. We love our country enough to want to make it better, and we love our community enough to want to serve it. So for me, it all comes from there. I drew a lot of inspiration from my local community. I think it says something really great about Australia, that we got a Prime Minister from Housing Commission. We've got a Treasurer from Logan City, who draws great inspiration from a treasurer from Bankstown back in the day. It says something good about the opportunity which is available to people in this country. And my experience is different to yours, Nick. I didn't come from a political family. Really, I'm here because of that powerful combination of growing up in a community where it felt like the opportunities in Australia aren't always fairly shared, and trying to pick up that thing that Lang said to Keating, if you've got the ability to speak up for other people, you've got a responsibility to speak up for other people. My mum was a nurse for almost 5 decades. I had a modern history teacher who encouraged me. I read that Michael Gordon book about Keating. Paul says all the time when he was a kid, he saw Churchill and he said, if that's the game that Churchill's in, that's the game that I want to be in. And I felt the same way about Paul. I was seeing this guy from the suburbs with that turn of phrase and the big change-making instincts. And I thought, if that's the game Paul's in, that's the game I want to be in. It says something good about Australia that we were both able to be treasurers given our backgrounds.
For those who are listening who don't know where Logan City is, it's in Brisbane, and it's as working class as you can get, really, out of suburban working class.
Yeah, so just south of Brisbane, and it's it's a beautiful community, but it's had its fair share of challenges.
Yep.
And when I sit at the cabinet table, I always try and make sure that I carry my community with me wherever I go. And without that grounding, this job would be much harder.
I wanted to return to, Cos mentioned we were honoured to have you give the 2024 Curtin oration here in Melbourne. People should head to our website, curtinrc.org, or the Treasurer's website, where you can read that very fine oration. And just wanted to deep dive. I like to talk about deep diving into the Mariana Trench. I think I've watched too much Octonauts. Jim's probably watched a lot of Octonauts episodes over the years with his kids. I've got 3 kids as well. You talk about the fourth economy, and you talk about these eras. And this is something that I've been on about for probably a decade as well. You're right. They're sort of the big transformative, epoch-defining, years. You can split them up into roughly 4 decades. So in Australia, we've got the late 1890s and the 1910s. Sometimes it's referred to as the Australian settlement, the Deaconite settlement, but it was driven by labour. And so we had arbitration, conciliation and arbitration made the law of the land. We had an active role for the state. We had, the emergence, the scaffolding of what would become the modern welfare state, particularly after World War II. And then in the 1940s, Curtin, Chifley, another one of your heroes, Jim, they used the opportunity provided by the crisis of World War II to reimagine what Australia could be like. So it could, and, manufacturing as the basis of the Australian economy, revitalising the welfare state, big nation building programs such as the Snowy Mountains, etc. And then, whether we like it or not, in the late 70s and early the 1980s, there was this third wave where the Australian economy was opened up to big market forces. But as one of your former bosses, Jim, and Treasurer of Australia, Wayne Swan, has pointed out, we did it the Australian way. Whilst the UK was UK under Thatcher, the US under Reagan, liberalised their economies, tore sort of the safety net and welfare state to shreds. And very critically, the critical distinction with Australia is they didn't work with unions. They tried to smash unions. We worked with unions in Australia and implemented things like the social wage with Medicare at its heart. And now really, after the global financial crisis of 15 years ago, we're here. We're here at this moment in history, and we're on the verge of this big fourth transformation.
Voters will tell you that in a very different way.
Yeah, this is the intellectual
but they know
theorising.
Something's going on. They know the world that they grew up in is ending, and they know when they turn on their TV or they go online and they look at politicians, they're looking for that. Who's gonna take care of us into that new phase? They know there's something going on, that their lives are transforming. There's a bit of grief going on too because they've lost that old life. So this is pre-pandemic, 2019.
Yep.
They just know, but they won't be able to articulate to you in an academic way. But they're starving for that vision.
There's something really important in what you say, Cos, because I keep coming back to this idea of people want to know where they fit. They want us to be upfront with them that the world is changing, and if we take the series of informed decisions, forward-looking decisions, then we can make that change work for them. It needn't be something that they be necessarily afraid of. And if you think about it another way, we want to govern for the whole country, but I believe that when it comes to people's approach to change, there's probably three camps. There's the camp in politics and in the community more broadly. There's a camp that says, unrealistically, we can just kind of hold back the tide of change, or we can turn back the clock, to mix the metaphors. That change isn't, change is voluntary. And that's, I think, absurd. There's another group that says, just let it rip, and let the cards fall where they may, and the consequences for human beings and communities are secondary to the broader kind of acceleration of change. And again, that's not really the right way to go about it. And there's a third category, and I count myself in this category, and I think most Australians live in this space too, which is the one that you just described, Cos, which is change is happening. There is great global uncertainty. There is all of this churn and change in the world. We've had 3 big economic shocks in 15 years, a GFC, COVID, an inflation spike after that. And we want there to be a flourishing after those 3 economic shocks in 15 years. But it won't happen by accident, and we won't benefit from it if we attach ourselves to either of those first 2 camps, whether it's let it rip or pretend it's not happening. It is happening. What really matters is the decision that leaders and governments and communities take to make the most of that change, to make sure that people are beneficiaries, not victims, as we keep saying. And if you wanted to boil everything down, the reason why some of us are involved in politics, all the good, all the bad, all the trolling and second guessing in the editorial pages of the major newspapers, the reason why we are here, or the reason I'm here, is because I think that generational responsibility is really, really important. I genuinely believe this is a defining decade for Australia. The decisions we take in the 2020s will determine how we travel for the coming decades as well. And we need to take that approach, which is to say, let's not pretend change isn't happening. Let's not let it rip. Let's work out the best version of change for Australia and try and set our sails accordingly.
I reckon, without getting into the elephant in the room, which is the election that's near and upon us, putting aside any of the shortcomings they may have about those political parties, the side that convinces people that's the mission they're on, that's what they want to do, will carry the day on come whenever election night is.
And hope.
100%.
This is my big beef with Peter Dutton. There's a lot of there's a lot of saying no. There's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of pointing out the pitfalls in this particular policy.
Well, I've made the point of
there's a lack of hope.
Last couple of weeks, I made the point through numerous interviews the last couple of weeks that his team's in the locker room whilst Labor's on the field building that narrative, right?
I think the negativity is explicit in his slogan. You know, he wants to take Australia backwards. He wants to take Australia back to something, which for all the reasons we've been talking about is kind of both unrealistic and undesirable.
Yeah, back on the beaten track, back on the sort of...
Yeah, that's it. Retrace our steps and double back. There's arguably not a worse time to risk the kind of reverse gear politics that Peter Dutton plays. But to couch that in the positive, all these things we're talking about, this idea of kind of staging points of progress and bringing people with us, you know, it's a pretty remarkable time right now when you consider what people have been through, when you consider this Australian exceptionalism that says we haven't had to choose between lower inflation and lower unemployment. We've been able to tick both boxes simultaneously together. We've got the debt down, interest rates have started to come down, real wages are growing. And so, you know, again, we've been through so much together as a country over 15 years, including over the last couple of years. We've made some good progress together, but the job's not done. And so I think one of the things we'll be asking the Australian people to consider when the election is called is the progress that we've made together, as difficult as it has been, and we acknowledge that. The idea of what comes next, which for us is, you know, cleaner and cheaper energy, better wages, early childhood education, human capital, technology, competition policy, all of these things that will strengthen our economy, and compare that to the risk that is posed by, you know, a guy who's got hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts and won't tell us where they're coming from. He wants lower wages and longer lunches. He can't pay for his nuclear reactors without coming after Medicare. There's a lot of risk associated with the Dutton agenda. And so I think that will be, you know, the way that we will ask Australians to consider the really important choice that they'll make at some point in the next 2 or 3 months.
You and Peter Dutton are both Queenslanders, obviously. Here's a revelation for you, Jim. I could have very nearly been a Queenslander when one side of my family came here from as Jewish refugees from Europe after the war. They lobbed in Toowoomba. You can imagine being Central European Jewish refugees landing in Toowoomba.
No, they would have been very welcome.
Well,
Toowoomba's a very welcoming
unfortunately,
place.
it lasted a week and they made the move to Melbourne. But you're both Queenslanders. Tell me the mood up in Queensland. Cos and I have talked on the previous episode of this show. We talked quite a bit about Victoria and for Labor some unsettling parallels with 1990 as an election year. But what's the mood up there in Queensland?
Well, Queensland is remarkable in the sense that we are very light on in numbers in the Albanese government from Queensland.
I was going to say you'd really like a few more comrades with you on the Treasury benches.
That's it. But no state would have more influence per person. The South Australians do pretty well, but Queensland's now got 3 cabinet ministers and a speaker and another frontbencher and arguably one of Australia's best backbench MPs in Shane Newman. And so the combination is pretty and an envoy in Nita Green as well. And so we've got a lot of influence, but we don't have a lot of numbers, and we're working on changing that. And some of our best candidates are in Queensland. There's a candidate in Griffith called Renee Coffey, who's, you know, there wouldn't be a better candidate in Australia than Renee. Similarly, Matt up in Leichhardt, the seat in far north Queensland. And so it's hard in Queensland. It has been hard really since the first Rudd election. We know that. We don't pretend otherwise. We have to do much better in Queensland. And we've got a couple of opportunities there which are exciting because we've got a lot of influence and now we need a bigger squad.
I reckon, Jim, historically for the last 30 years, I think, Queensland was a swing state. It was a absolutely critical state in terms of who was able to form government. That's obviously now changed. It's largely now the two big ones down south. However, you made the point about Griffiths, but those 3 Green seats and Leichhardt on election night are going to. Well, I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on those on those 4 seats in their entirety, because it'll be interesting to see. For example, Brisbane, Ryan, and Griffiths, whether the Greens can hold on to them or not.
Yeah.
And if they don't, who actually picks them up?
Yeah, I've read a lot of your stuff about the kind of splintered nature of the contests. We've got these Labor Greens contests, we've got these Liberal Teals contests, and that obviously introduces a huge amount of uncertainty. But I still believe, as I think you do, Cos, that this election will be a battle of the burbs.
Yeah,
that's where the big armies are joined. Is in suburbs, not unlike the ones that I represent. You mentioned Melbourne and Sydney. This will be won or lost in the outer suburbs, and that's why it's so important that we've tried to maintain this focus on the cost of living, while the other guys have tried to drag us into kind of culture wars and conflict. I read one thing which I didn't perfectly agree with something you said, Cos, in the last couple of days about, no side yet is talking about the economy. First of all, I don't agree with it because Medicare is cost of living. If there's more bulk billing, there's less pressure on.
Actually, my colleague Tony Barry, they pulled me up on that. He said, you're wrong because health
You've
is cost of living.
You've been pulled up by a lib.
I have, mate. I have.
Deary me.
Because he's actually quite critical. He's actually making the point you're making.
He's a great bloke.
He's basically saying that his side is not on the field on the economy at the moment.
And not just because of that, but I rate Tony. And every political professional rates Tony and yourself as a very effective tag team. But I guess the point I'm trying to get to is it'll be a battle of the burbs, and that means it will be about the economy. I hope it is. I'm spoiling for a fight on the economy. Nothing would make me happier than if this election was contested on the economy. That's why I've thrown the challenge out there. I'd happily debate Angus Taylor weekly, election.
He's a witness protection, Jim. He's a witness protection.
He goes missing from time to time.
We have some numbers on that front which will probably make you happy, but stay tuned.
Right. Yeah, and so I want it to be about the economy, and I want it to be about cost of living versus their culture wars. And also, I think it comes to this. Ideally, people will understand that the whole parliament understands that there's been cost of living pressure, quite extreme cost of living pressure. There's nobody serious in the parliament who denies that. What matters is what you do about it. And we've done a whole bunch of things, about half a dozen big things, which we found room in the budget for, which Peter Dutton and the opponents, they said no to, they opposed. And so people would genuinely be much worse off now if they had their way. And so I think that plays forward as well, because if you think about lower wages, you think about a tax on Medicare like last time Peter Dutton was the health minister, you think about how expensive these nuclear reactors would be, pushing up energy prices. I think it will be a cost of living election. It will be an election about the economy, and that's something that I'd really welcome.
We welcome that as well, and it's been our great pleasure to welcome you on Curtin's Cast. I know you've got a little side hustle as Treasurer Australia, so. Jim, we are super appreciative of you making the time to speak to us today. I'm actually heading up to Brisbane in a few days. We go for the same AFL team, the Mighty Brisbane Lions. If you can do something about Cyclone Alfred though, because ETA is about 3 days away, and there's a little bit of conjecture as to whether the opening game of the AFL season is going to happen. So if you could sort of sort that out. That'd be appreciated. It's been fantastic to have you on the show, mate. Best of luck. It's always great talking to you, and best of luck for the year ahead in the election. This super important decision that Australians have to make. And
let's talk about running when you settle down after the election. I can give you some tips.
I'm pleased you didn't say let's go for a run, because I reckon I'd be good for about the first 3% of your run in the morning. But it's been really nice talking to you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks heaps.
Cheers, mate. Thank you. Well, that's it for episode 2 of Curtin's Cast. Thank you so much, Cozzy. We'll see you next week. To our Curtinistas out there, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Treasurer Chalmers. Do hit the like, subscribe, share button across all your favourite podcasting streaming options. Next week, we do promise to bring you live and direct from the UK, Morris Glasman, Lord Glasman, Baron Glasman, who'll be talking about all things Blue Labour, British Labour, Keir Starmer, the rise of Trumpism, Steve Bannon, the godfather of MAGA, and his bromance with JD Vance. Stay tuned for that one. And we also have a really, really interesting surprise guest. Not all of our guests on Curtin Cast are going to be drawn from the Labor side of politics. And we've got a very special guest from the other side of the aisle who hails from our second spiritual home of Perth, or just outside of Perth. So you might want to guess who this might be. We'll be talking to him in a fortnight's time. Don't forget, if you are based in Melbourne and you're intending to come to the John Curtin Research Centre 2025 annual gala dinner with our very, very special guest, Richard Marles, Deputy Prime Minister of Australia and Minister for Defence in the Albanese Labor government, time is ticking. In fact, time will be out by the end of today. Close the business Wednesday, the 5th of March. So put in your diaries, buy your tickets, buy your tables, the JCRC gala dinner with Richard Marles in Melbourne at Ariel South Wharf on Wednesday, the 12th of March. Don't miss out. But until next time, it's ciao and arrivederci.